The kind of place where you spent your days doing trail maintenance, running searches, checking in on shelters, and watching weather roll over ridgelines that had been there long before anybody thought to name them. I love that job. I want to be clear about that, because the way this story ends might make it sound like I was unhappy out there, like I had been looking for a reason to leave. I wasn't. I wasn't miserable or isolated or struggling. I was good at what I did, and I knew the land the way you can only know land that you've walked in every season for years on end. Every switchback, every shelter log, every blowdown across a trail. I knew where the bears denned in late October and where the water ran clean and where it didn't. I knew the places that looked hard on a map but were easy going, and I knew places that looked easy but would turn your ankles if you weren't paying attention. I knew the park well enough that it trusted me back, if that makes any sense. There are places you can spend a lot of time without ever really knowing, and there are places that open up to you after enough seasons. This one opened up. I knew its moods. I knew when a storm was coming 6 hours before the weather radio did, just from the way the air felt on the back of my neck. I knew which trails the animals used at night, and which ones they tended to avoid. I knew about the Notch. Yeah, that's what we called it. The rangers who had been out there long enough. It wasn't an official designation. It doesn't appear on any map under that name. It's just a section of trail about 6 miles from the western trailhead, where the path cuts through a long, low saddle between 2 ridges. The kind of terrain that looks unremarkable from above. A little dip between 2 high points. A few hundred yards of relatively flat going before the trail climbs up again. It was the kind of place that you would hike through 100 times and never think twice about. My first season there, an older ranger named Harwick took me out on a full-day patrol and brought me through the Notch around midday. I remember that he walked a little bit faster through that section. Not a lot, not fast enough that a person who didn't know him would have noticed, but just enough that I noticed, because I had been watching how he moved all morning, learning the way that you learn from somebody who's been somewhere longer than you have. And when we came out on the other side of the open ridge, he slowed back down and lit a cigarette, and he stood there looking out over the valley like he was admiring the view. I asked him about it on the walk back. I said something like, "Hey, you picked up the pace through that saddle, something that I should know about." He gave me a look that wasn't quite dismissive and wasn't quite a warning. It was the look of a man deciding how much to say to somebody that he didn't know well yet. And then he said, "Oh, some places you don't linger." And that was it. I waited for more, but it didn't come. I tried once more a few weeks later, and he changed the subject with the practiced ease of somebody who had been changing that particular subject for a long time. Harwick retired 2 years into my posting without ever saying anything else about it. I went to his retirement party at a bar in town and watched him shake hands with people and smile with what looked like genuine relief, and I thought about asking him one more time. I didn't. He was a man who was happy to be leaving something behind, and I thought maybe that he had earned that. I decided to put that thought on the back burner and file it away. I wouldn't forget about it, but I just set it aside. I stopped walking fast through the Notch myself after about my 3rd year. I don't know when it happened exactly, it wasn't really a choice. At some point I just got used to the way that it felt in there. The way the sound changed slightly as you crossed into the saddle, like somebody had turned a dial down a notch. The way the light came through the canopy at an angle that always seemed wrong for the time of day, no matter when you went through. Even at noon in July, the light in the Notch had a late afternoon quality to it. Thin and sideways. It was like it was coming from somewhere other than directly above. You get used to places. That's what I told myself. The brain's very good at normalizing things that are just slightly wrong, especially if you encounter them often enough. What I couldn't normalize was the disappearances. Not that they happened often. That's the important thing to understand. If people had been vanishing out of that trail section on any kind of regular schedule, somebody above my pay grade would have paid attention and something would have changed. What happened instead was the kind of low, slow drip of incidents that never quite triggered a formal response. One missing person every year or two, sometimes longer stretches between, almost always solo hikers, almost always in the stretch between the western approach and the eastern ridge exit. It was almost always reported by somebody waiting at a trailhead who said their partner or friend was supposed to be back hours ago. I ran 8 search operations in that corridor over my 11 years. 8. Most rangers in similar postings might run 2 or 3 over the same span, and even that would be on the higher side. I knew the number was unusual. I told myself what there was to tell myself, and that the terrain was more technical than it looked. That solo hikers often underestimated the elevation change on the return leg, and that the trail conditions in that particular saddle could fall apart fast in wet weather and throw off somebody's footing or timing. All of that was true, but none of it was the whole truth. The part that I didn't talk about even to myself for a long time was that 6 of those 8 people came back. Now I know that sounds like the good outcome. Statistically it is. Most missing person searches don't end with the person walking out on their own 3 days later looking fine. When that happens, you're supposed to feel relieved, file the paperwork and move on. And I did. Every time. I filed the paperwork, moved on, and I kept the other thing, the thing that I had noticed in a room in the back of my head that I didn't open very often. The first time it happened, I genuinely didn't think much about it. A woman named Tressa, late 30s, an experienced hiker with a solid gear, went missing on a Tuesday afternoon and then walked out early on Thursday morning. She was calm and oriented, knew what day it was, knew her own name, showing no signs of injury or exposure. She had eaten her food supplies, which told us that she hadn't been in survival panic mode. She didn't run through them, she ate them like a normal person would. She remembered Tuesday clearly. She remembered starting into the trail, checking her map, stopping to eat lunch near a boulder that she described. She didn't remember Wednesday at all though. Not pieces of it, I mean all of it. She said it didn't bother her, which I noticed, because it seemed like it should. But people respond to weird things in all different kind of ways, and a gap in memory after getting lost wasn't medically alarming on its own. So I let it go. The second time, a man named Portis came out after 2 days saying nearly the same thing. He got turned around, couldn't account for most of his second day, but he was calm about it and he seemed fine. The third and fourth times, I started paying closer attention. There was something else too, beyond the memory gaps, something smaller and harder to articulate. It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, which is probably why I never said it out loud for years. The people who came back from the notch section weren't quite right afterward. They weren't traumatized, I want to be correct about that, because there's a version of what I'm describing that sounds like PTSD or disassociation. And what I saw wasn't that. What I saw was the opposite of distress. They were too okay. They were okay in a way that felt thin, like a layer of paint over something that wasn't solid underneath. You would talk to them during the check-in process and they would respond correctly to everything, hit every beat of a normal conversation, say the right things in the right order. But there was a lag to it. A small one, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Like the words were arriving a fraction of a second before the face decided what to do with them. I noticed it first with Portis. He came out on a Tuesday morning and spent about 2 hours at our station while we processed the paperwork. And we talked most of that time about how long he had been hiking, where he was headed next, what the trail had been like before we lost it. He was pleasant and responsive, and he answered everything. But he laughed at things a half second after he should have, in a way that almost felt mechanical. Once when I made a comment about how the weather had been unusually dry for the season, he looked at me for just a moment too long, a deliberate pause where there shouldn't have been one, like he was computing something, before he nodded and agreed. I talked myself out of it immediately. I had been in the woods for most of that week running the search. My read on normal conversational rhythm was probably a little off. The man had been lost for 2 days, and fatigue does strange things to how a person carries themselves. But then I thought back to Tressa, and I realized that I had seen the same thing in her and hadn't consciously registered it until now. That pause, the delayed response, and then with the next one and the next one too. 6 for 6. All 6 of the people who came back from the notch had that same quality to them. Present but not quite there, answering but not really responding. It was correct, but there was still something off about it. All 6 of them went home, back to their lives, and I never heard anything further about any of them. Which could mean that they were fine, or it could mean that nobody who knew them was paying quite the right kind of attention. I kept those thoughts to myself for a long time, years even. There was really nothing to do with them. I couldn't file a report that said hikers who got lost near the notch came back acting slightly off in ways that I was unable to quantify. I couldn't point to anything, and so I carried it and I kept walking that trail. And the thing with Callum Vress was what changed the shape of it. Callum was a solo hiker who went missing in early September, about 5 years into my posting. He disappeared on a Friday evening and came back on Sunday morning, the same routine. He was easy to remember. Tall, red-haired, a loud friendly laugh when he signed in at the trailhead. The kind of person who makes an impression without even trying. He had been experienced enough with good gear and no red flags. When he came out Sunday, he went through the same motions as the others had. He got turned around, couldn't account for a day, but he wasn't concerned about it. I cleared him out, watched him drive away, and I thought, well, there it is again. On the following Wednesday, I was doing a routine inspection of the lower meadows section, a flat stretch about a mile west of the notch, where the trail runs along a creek before it starts climbing. I came around a bend and I stopped. Callum was standing on the far side of the meadow, maybe 200 yards off, right at the edge of a tree line. He was wearing the same jacket that he had had on when he came through. He was completely still, facing me, and the distance was far enough that I couldn't read his face, but I could see his shape clearly against the tree line. I raised a hand and he raised a hand back. I started walking toward him because a civilian that far off trail 4 days after being cleared out was worth checking on. He could have been injured, could have re-entered the park without signing in, could have been having some kind of delayed reaction to the experience. But the meadow was wet from recent rain, the grass high and slow going, and by the time that I had covered maybe half the distance, he was gone. Not walking away, but gone. No movement through the grass, no sound in the trees, nothing disturbed. I stood in the middle of the meadow for a while and looked at the tree line where he had been. And then I went back to the station and checked the trail register going back about 2 weeks. Callum had not re-entered the park. I didn't tell anybody about it. I thought about it for a long time instead. And then Dessa disappeared, and thinking about it stopped being enough. Dessa Myron had been stationed with me for 3 years by that point. She had come to the post fresher from a long stint in the Pacific Northwest, and she was, without question, the best ranger that I've worked alongside in my career. She knew backcountry first aid better than most. She could navigate by terrain features in zero visibility, and she had the quality that the best outdoor people have, a kind of physical intelligence. an instinct for what a piece of ground was going to do before it did it. And beyond the professional stuff, she was good company. 11 years in that kind of posting means spending a lot of hours with a small number of people, and you learn quickly who you want those hours to be with. And Dessa was easy to be around in the particular way that competent, unself-conscious people are easy to be around. She didn't perform, didn't fill silences that didn't need filling. She had a dry sense of humor that only showed up when she was comfortable. And over 3 years of shared patrols and long shifts and bad weather and equipment failures and all the rest of it, she had gotten very comfortable. We had a running joke between us. It had started with a broken piece of trail equipment and a bear that had shown up at an inconvenient moment. And by that 3rd year, it had evolved into something that required no explanation between us, where one of us could drop a single word from the original incident into a conversation, and both of us knew exactly what it meant. I'm telling you about this because of what happened later. Dessa went out on a solo patrol on a Thursday morning in late October. Clear weather, a familiar terrain, and a route that she had run probably 30 times. She left at first light and didn't come back. And by early evening, she wasn't responding to radio, which was unusual enough that I ran a check of her planned route. Nothing. I put out a search that evening and ran it through the night without finding any sign. She walked out the next morning from the eastern end of the notch, just before 8. She looked fine, moving normally, and gear intact and no injuries visible. She had gotten off trail somehow in the afternoon, spent the night sheltering under a rock overhang that she had found, and found the trail again in the morning. I knew before she finished her second sentence. It's hard to explain how you know something like that without being able to point to a specific thing. It wasn't one detail, it was the composite, the total picture. The way she stood when she talked, it was off. Dessa talked with her whole body when she was engaged with something, a forward lean, hands moving. The woman standing at the trailhead was standing straight and square, weight evenly distributed, hands at her sides. Correct, neutral, like a diagram of a person rather than a person. I ran through the check-in process carefully, taking longer than normal, keeping her talking. She answered everything. She knew the date, the terrain, the details of her trip. She even mixed in a little mild self-deprecation about getting off trail, appreciation for the shelter find, and her readiness to get back at it. Everything landed correctly. But then I said the one word from a running joke. I dropped into a sentence about her gear in the exact context that we had used it 100 times. She looked at me, and she waited for me to continue. She wasn't confused or caught off guard, but just waiting, like she was ready for the next sentence, and the word that I had used was a normal word, with a normal meaning and nothing more than that. I kept my face neutral and finished the sentence, and I moved on. I told her to take the following day off, and she said that she would, and she said it the way you say something that's been said to you. I told her to take the following day off, and she said that she would. I watched her drive away, and I stood in the parking lot for a long time after her car was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bunk in the station, and I stare at the ceiling. I tried to talk myself around it. I listed everything she had done and said correctly during her check-in, and there was a lot. She had been right about almost everything. And the joke, well, maybe she was tired. Maybe she had blanked on it. I mean, people forget things, it didn't mean anything. Except I had seen that same expression on other faces over the years. 6 people, in fact. You can tell yourself something doesn't mean anything for a long time before the weight of it gets heavy enough that you just can't carry it anymore. I went into the notch the next morning. I want to be clear that I knew this was probably a mistake. Not probably, but definitely. Going into a trail section alone without telling anyone, specifically because I thought something in there had just replaced my colleague with a copy. It's not a decision with a lot of good outcomes attached to it. I went anyway because I'd been sitting with this for years and the alternative was to keep sitting with it. And after the night that I had just had, that felt like its own kind of danger. I went in at first light when the sky was just starting to lighten behind the eastern ridge. The notch in that early morning gray had the same quality that it always did. The sound shifting as I crossed into the saddle, dampening in a way that wasn't just the terrain. The light filtering through the canopy at that wrong angle, even though there was barely any light yet to speak of. I walked slow and paid attention to everything. I had been through that corridor hundreds of times, but I had always moved through it, always had somewhere to be on the other side. That morning, I stopped in the middle of the saddle and just stood there, and I let myself feel what was there to feel. What was there to feel was pressure. That's the closest that I can get to it. Not physical pressure, not like the air had changed. More like the specific feeling you get when you know that somebody is watching you, and you haven't located them yet. That heightened awareness that tightens the back of your neck and makes your periphery sharper. That feeling, but coming from every direction at once. I left the trail about a quarter mile into the saddle, pushing through a stand of bushes and down a short slope to a flat section that I had noticed on maps but had never had a reason to visit. It was maybe 3 acres of softwood forest on a shelf of land below the main ridgeline, screened from the trail by the thicket above it. The ground was fairly soft, but we hadn't had any rain recently. Instead, it was the softness of earth that's been washed repeatedly for a very long time. The organic layer broken down by years of use into something fine and compressed. There were fire rings, 3 of them that I could see, made of local stone in different parts of the clearing. They were cold and had been cold for a while, but they had been built and used and rebuilt many times. The stones rearranged and reset in a way that spoke to long habitation. The pathways between the trees were worn down to bare dirt and lines that matched no trail layout that I had ever seen, curving between the trunks in patterns that looked functional rather than random, trails between specific trees rather than to any exit. No gear, no trash, no modern trace of any kind. Just the impression of use, deep and old and ongoing. Like a camp that had been occupied for decades or longer by people who left nothing behind. I stood in the middle of it and the silence changed. That's still the best way that I can put it. It changed quality. It went from the ordinary silence of early morning in the woods, which isn't silence really, more like small sounds, birds starting, wind in the upper canopy, the distant percussion of a creek, to something that felt pressurized and deliberate. A silence that was happening on purpose. I turned around slowly. There was a figure standing about 30 yards away with her back to me, completely still. The jacket was a blue windbreaker that I recognized, the same one Tressa had been wearing when she had come through 5 years before. Her posture was rigid and exact, upright in a way that wasn't quite how people stand when they're just standing somewhere. She wasn't moving. I looked around without turning my head first, using the corner of my eyes. There were others, and the trees on all sides, spaced maybe 20 to 30 yards apart, standing the same way, their backs to me, still. I counted 8 before I stopped counting because the ones further in the shadows were harder to make out and I didn't want to know the number. Every one of them had their back to me. Now I've spent a lot of years in backcountry and I know the specific way that fear operates out there. The fast spike when something startles you, the quick inventory of rational explanations, the leveling out as your brain talks the spike back down. Standing in that clearing with those figures in the trees around me, I waited for that leveling out. It didn't come. The fear just kept building in a slow escalating way, like pressure behind a dam, like my body knew something that my mind was still working on catching up to. I started walking back the way that I had come, and I kept my pace even. I didn't run, and I didn't look at the figures as I passed through them, and I don't know why. Some instinct that running or looking would change the rules of whatever was happening in a way that I didn't want to test. I kept my eyes forward and I walked, back through the bushes and up the short slope to the trail. I had made it maybe half a mile back toward the western trailhead when I heard it in the trees to my left. Not footsteps, the sound was too irregular for footsteps, more like something moving through the undergrowth at a consistent pace. Brush bending and releasing in a rhythm that matched my walking exactly. I sped up. The rhythm sped up. I pushed to a near jog, and whatever was in the trees matched me without any apparent effort, not falling back and not crashing closer, just keeping pace, maintaining the same distance and letting me know that it was there. I ran the last mile, and I'm not ashamed of that. I ran hard as quickly as I could, and I hit the trailhead and came out into the parking area and bent over with my hands on my knees, and I breathed. When I straightened up and looked back at the tree line, the sound had stopped. The woods were still. Dessa was standing at the far edge of the parking lot. She was at the tree line on the north side, maybe 80 yards from where I was standing, and she was watching me the way figures in the clearing had been watching nothing. Still patient and facing me directly this time. I stood there and looked at her, and she raised her hand in a slow wave. The same one that Callum had given me from across the meadow. The same arm angle, same pace, duration, the same moment of holding it before lowering it. Not similar, but identical, with a precision that no two people naturally share. Like it had seen a wave once and it was showing it back to me. I got in my truck and I drove to town. I sat in a diner on the main street for about 2 hours and drank coffee that I couldn't taste, while the breakfast crowd came and went around me. And I thought about what I was going to do with what I knew. The answer that I arrived at was, well, transfer. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like running away from a problem that I could have escalated or reported, brought to somebody with more resources. I've turned that over many times since, but I want you to think carefully about what that conversation will look like. I go to my supervisor and tell him that I believe an ancient presence in the notch saddle has been replacing hikers with copies of themselves for at least a decade, and that one of those copies is currently on active duty as a park ranger. I believe this because the copies have a slight conversational delay, and one of them didn't get an inside joke. What happens next is not an investigation. So I filed a transfer request the morning after, citing career development and a desire for a new type of posting, and nobody pushed back because I had built up enough goodwill over 11 years that it read as a reasonable choice. The last 2 weeks were administrative, paperwork, handoffs, and briefing the support staff on ongoing maintenance items. I stayed off the backcountry trails. And Dessa came back to work 2 days after she came out of the notch, and she was, by every observable measure, doing her job correctly. She would answer the radio promptly, complete her patrol logs, spoke to the other staff in a way that passed without comment. I watched the rangers who had known her for a while, the ones who had worked alongside her for years, and I thought that I saw it in some of their faces. That hesitation when they interacted with her. A moment of something unresolved that they swallowed and moved past. No one said anything. I didn't say anything either. What we were all doing, I think, was giving each other permission to not know. My replacement showed up 2 days before my final day. His name was Edwick Bauer, and he was younger than me by over a decade. He had the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not yet having been worn down by the physical reality of the work. He was good though, asked smart questions about the trail systems, about the shelter maintenance schedule, about seasonal patterns that I had noticed over the years. I found myself liking him. We spent most of that day walking the park maps together and going over some operational stuff. He was sharp and attentive and took in everything that I told him. At some point in the afternoon, in a natural lull, he mentioned that he had actually hiked this park years before, back when he was in college. He said it warmly, like he had remembered it in a good way. He said it was part of what had made him want to work for the service. Something about this particular stretch of the Appalachians had gotten into him and never fully left. I asked him which trails he had spent the most time on, just a friendly conversation starter. He thought about it for a moment, and he said that he had actually gotten lost once on the western corridor. He laughed a little, said it was one of those things that seemed genuinely scary while it was happening, and then it turned into a story that he told at parties later. Took him almost 4 days to find his way out. He said that he had been a little embarrassed about it, an experienced hiker getting turned around on a well-maintained trail. But the park was more disorienting than it looked once you got off the main trail. I looked at him, like really looked at him with the same attention that I had been applying for 11 years to the people who came back from that section of trail. He was still talking, still smiling, telling me about the way the light hit the ridgelines in the morning, how it was so beautiful and different from anything that he had seen before, almost like a different quality of light. I listened to the words and I watched his face, the timing of his expressions, how his eyes tracked while he talked, and the pace at which his effect arrived and settled and moved on. I watched and I waited for that lag. I don't know what I found. I want to be honest about that. I was watching a man that I had known for 6 hours under circumstances where I had been frightened and sleep deprived for the better part of 2 days. My calibration was off and I knew it. What I saw on his face could have been the slight, social surface tension that comes from meeting somebody new and wanting to make a good impression. It could have been nothing. I shook his hand at the end of the day, told him that he was going to do well out here and that I meant it, or I had tried to mean it, or I said it because there was nothing else to say. I drove away and I didn't look back at the trailhead. I've thought about it almost every day since. I've thought about what I should have done differently and whether I should have pushed harder before I left. And whether the thing in the notch is still out there doing what it does, taking people for a day or 2 or 4 and sending something back out that can walk and talk and sign paperwork and do the job and make conversation and even raise a hand in a wave. I've thought about all the people in those returned hikers' lives, partners, family, friends, coworkers, who maybe felt something not quite right and couldn't name it, who maybe still feel it, who maybe lie awake sometimes with a vague unease that they can't find the source of. Might think about Dessa most nights, about the 3 years that we worked together, the patrols and the long shifts and the dumb running joke that we had built up over 100 small moments. I think about whether that thing that came back understands any of that, or whether it's just holding the shape of her the way that you hold a shape in your hands, aware of the edges but not the weight. Oh, I hope I was wrong. I've already said that, but I want to say it again, because I think it matters to hold the possibility of being wrong right up next to the things that you're most certain about. I could have built this whole thing out of grief and loneliness in too many years watching a trail that made me uneasy. The human mind is extremely good at finding patterns, especially in things that we're afraid of. And I've been afraid of the notch for years before any of this happened. So maybe I was wrong. But I wasn't wrong about the wave. I know what I saw when Callum raised his hand from across the meadow. And I know what I saw when Dessa did the same from the parking lot. I know those were the same gesture, reproduced exactly. and I know that's not something two different people do by coincidence. And I know that when I said the word from our dumb, irreplaceable 3-year-old joke, Dessa looked at me with a perfectly pleasant face and waited for me to keep talking, and there was nothing behind her eyes that knew what I had just said. Whatever is in the notch watches. It watches long enough that it can walk a person back out of the woods and into their own life and pass almost without notice. It's had a long time to practice, I think, maybe a very long time. Adwick is working that posting now. I haven't called the station. I picked up the phone a few times and put it back down, because I don't know who would be on the other end and I don't know what I would say if I did. I just know that I'm not going back.